Are we ready?
Okay, we're ready to begin.
All right, so I'll call this meeting to order. It is 6:08 p.m. and I'm Richard Nobles, and I serve as the chair of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. And I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Linda Heitzman Powell.
Here.
David Stevens. Abby Callis.
Here.
Mark Goodman.
Here.
Matthew Golker.
Present.
Jessica Hamilton.
Here.
Edward Hunter.
Present.
Tiffany Johnson. Sarah Kirk.
Here.
Rodney McNeil. Jay Middleton.
Here.
And Doug Wright.
Here.
I also note that the following staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns with the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA. Does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting to allow sufficient time to get through all the items on the agenda. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to KOMA. On July 6th, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of the advisory committee meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, bsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by sending an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I believe no one is currently on the conference call line, but if I hear a beep and someone enters on the conference call line, I will let you know.
Thank you, David. Again, this meeting is called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda, which is the approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move we approve the agenda.
Doug moves to approve the agenda. Do I have a second?
I will second.
Abby seconds. All in favor of approval of the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. The motion passes. Second, or moving to the third item, is the approval and the review of the minutes from the meeting on June 6th. I take it that everyone has had an opportunity to review the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from June 6th?
And Richard, apologize for the late notice on this. Leslie Allen and I had a conversation just a little bit ago this afternoon. We did catch one item that we think a small edit could take care of in the minutes. So if someone makes a motion to approve the minutes, we'd request the authority to make that small change. On page 3, you may recall at the last meeting, there was a good discussion about creating a new regulation for documentation of continuing education. For item 5BI, item 3, there is a reference to include the language for item D. And we do believe that the item number 3 should make reference to not only item D, but also item E. And so in number 4, there's a reference to include the language from item E, but actually for item 4, we can remove the reference to E and just have that a certificate of completion would be sufficient for that. So I realize it's kind of a technical change, but as we were going through trying to write the new language for that regulation, we realized that in looking at that other set of regulations, D and E should really be referenced for item 3. And then for item 4, it should just say the certificate of completion. So as long as there's not any objection to that, if someone could include that when they recommend the minutes be approved, I would appreciate it.
Is there any objection to approval of the minutes as amended by David Fine? With that being said, is there a motion to approve the minutes as amended by David Fine?
I will move to approve with the amendments that have been provided.
Abby moves to approve the amendments, to approve the minutes as amended. That is a tongue twister. Do I have a second?
I'll second it. This is Jessica.
Jessica seconds the motion. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All those not in favor, please signify by same sign. The motion carries. And the minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda is a greeting by me. So just very quickly, I'm Richard Nobles, and I am the incoming chair of this subcommittee for the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee of the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. I'm a clinical psychologist out of the University of Kansas Health System in Kansas City, Kansas. I work with folks who have sustained a concussion. I've been at KU for almost 2 years now, and I really enjoy the work that I've done here on the BSRB. I've only been on the board for a little over a year, and I was the person in graduate school who probably enjoyed ethics class the most. And it's been something that I have enjoyed over the course of my career, helping people understand what rules and regulations are and helping the public do what they need to do to get things straightened out. So I see my responsibility as a fiduciary one, and I want to do whatever we can on this committee to establish rules and regulations that would make common sense for the general public and make Kansas a better place. So that's kind of the long and short of what I would like to do with the committee. And yeah, I think that's just want to make things short and sweet. I will also say that I try to run things pretty quickly. So we will hopefully land the plane on time. I tell my clients that we will take off on time and we will land the plane on time. So I think you will see that meetings will end at 8 o'clock, almost on the dot. If we need to go over, we will. And otherwise, I'll try to get us out of here right on the dot. So if you have any questions for me, though, I take them certainly offline. If you have any questions for me now, I'm more than happy to answer anything. And I look forward to meeting and working with y'all over the course of the next couple of years. So there you go. And moving on, I'd like to introduce the new members of the committee. We've got 5 new folks who have joined us since our last time together. And I'll ask you to just say a little bit about yourselves as I go around to each person. And we'll start with Mark Goodman. If you can tell us a little bit about where you are in the state and what you do, and maybe a little bit about why you wanted to serve on the committee. So Mark, I'll have you go first.
Everybody okay. I'm on speakerphone. I live in Hutchinson, Kansas, and I'm in private practice. It'll be 48 years continuous on the 15th of August for me. 48 years in private practice. I love what I do. I want to give back now. I'm in my mid-70s age-wise, and I've just been blessed with a wonderful career overall. And I'm computer illiterate and terrible when it comes to technology, but I enjoy all the face-to-face interaction with, my clients / patients. And I graduated Brigham Young University on August 15th, 1975 is when I graduated, and then did a postdoc at University of North Carolina Medical School and a pre-doc at the Devereux Foundation, Devon, Pennsylvania, and then went back to school in my late 40s where I can have a degree in psychopharmacology. I can prescribe medication. There are 5 states that will allow us to prescribe. I passed my board exam in medicine and psychopharmacology, but I'm always going to be a clinical psychologist first. And that's the way it's been. And again, it'll be 48 years for me on the 15th of August. I guess I'll stop there unless anybody wants to know anything else.
Well, thank you, Mark. We are glad to have you here in your experience. I'm sure that it will be very valuable to us as we do the work that we do. Matthew, a little bit about you.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Gelker. I am also a clinical psychologist, obviously. Been in practice for 11-ish years at this point. Started with the military, was active duty for about 5-6 years. Spent a year in a GS position at Fort Riley at the hospital, and then decided to go into private practice. Currently co-own a private practice with my wife, who's an LCPC. And we've been here in Manhattan, Kansas, running this practice for about 6 years now. Joined the board because between military and some other community opportunities here in town, I've always liked kind of being a part of something else. And I said it was time to maybe kind of get involved in the broader practice of psychology and kind of how we function. So that's me.
We're glad to have you, certainly. Ed Hunter, it's good to see you, Ed. You are muted.
I just said a bunch of profound and interesting things, and I'll have to repeat them. So, yeah, my name is Edward Hunter. I go by Ned with an N, so you're welcome to call me that. I've been in Kansas for a long time. I believe my license was originally in 1989. So very used to it. I'm a transplant from Washington, D.C. and Chicago and Houston. I've been all over the place, but I've landed here for quite a while and love Kansas. Love Kansas City, which is where I am, Kansas City, Kansas. I'm actually at the University of Kansas Medical Center also, as you know, Richard. I'm within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, where I have the honor of being the director of training in the Division of Psychology. Love doing that, love training. And probably the biggest reason that I wanted to join this group is that I thought that I might be able to bring something to the board related to training, because obviously they're intimately entwined with one another. I'm a guy that's always tried to do the right thing, so I think I'm right on board with what the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board is all about. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to working with all of you.
Looking forward to working with you. Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kirk, and I'm the director of a training clinic in the clinical PhD program at KU on the Lawrence campus. And I'm just very interested because I like to connect our trainees to all things that are related to licensure and try to keep up the best I can. But I thought bridging that gap would be a great thing to do.
Well, thank you for serving, and I'm sure that it will be an experience where you can bridge the gap that you're talking about. And lastly, but certainly not least, Jay.
Yeah, Jay Middleton. I currently am working at CHC SEK in Pittsburgh, Kansas, which is a federally qualified health center. I graduated with my PhD in counseling psychology from Louisiana Tech in 2017, did my pre and postdoc at counseling services at K-State, and then have been working at CHC SEK ever since. You know, you work at a community health center and you work with a little bit of everything, but you know, grief, LGBTQ issues, anxiety, depression, kind of work with it all. I was thrilled to work with the LP advisory board. I love issues dealing with training, ethics, policy. So I was really excited for this opportunity.
Wonderful. And I'm again looking forward to working with all of you. You all have fantastic experiences that I think that will be integral to the work that we do here on this committee. And with that being said, I'll move on to the next agenda item. That's the executive director's report, and I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Richard. And I apologize in going through the agenda. We do have one additional new member, and I'm going to put him on the spot here if he has anything to say, but there has been a change in board membership that I was going to cover in my report, and one of our new members on the board is a new public member of this committee. So David Stevens, he is logged into the meeting now, he's present, and David just recently joined the board as of July 1st. And so, Richard, if it's okay with you, maybe David could—
No, please.
Hi, sure. I live in Roland Park, Kansas. I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas, and went to undergrad at KU. I went to law school in Indiana and currently serve as the Senior Vice President of Compliance and Associate General Counsel at WellSky, a health IT company that's headquartered in Overland Park. I've specialized in health law for 15 years and was honored to be appointed to the BSRB by Governor Kelly, and look forward to supporting the work of this committee.
Thank you. We look forward to working with you.
Well, I'll go ahead and start my report. For those of you that are new to the advisory committee, every meeting I provide an update. Some of those include operations by the BSRB. Also, we talk a little bit about some of the items for the most recent board meeting. The board meets in the off month between the advisory committee meetings, and so there's usually always one board meeting in between your meetings, and I'll provide some updates from that. And then we work with a number of other groups, such as the legislature, national associations, and so I'll touch upon some of those types of items too. And for some of you who I have not met before, but I've communicated through email, nice to meet you all and be able to put a face to a name. If you do need anything from our staff here at the BSRB, if we can help you in any way, feel free to reach out to me. And also Leslie Allen, if you have not met her, Leslie is the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB. She's been with the agency for a number of years now. And so both of us are great resources for you. So if we can help you with your onboarding process of being advisory committee members or any other questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. In terms of some updates on BSRB operations, so just to give you an idea of some of the work that's being done here at the office, every state agency is required to submit about 15 annual reports as part of the state auditing process. The BSRB is one of the smaller agencies. We have 10 staff members, but we do have to submit those reports as well. So I had completed all of those and submitted those by the deadline. Additionally, the governor has 3-year IT plans for every state agency. And it's our job to submit revisions to that, any accomplishments, any modifications to that 3-year plan. And so we did put in for some additional goals for the IT services that we are receiving, and items such as pursuing electronic records instead of paper records, replacing some of our hardware here with more current hardware, different things like that is what we're really focusing on. So we did make a revision to our 3-year IT plan. Additionally, there was a bill that passed during the 2021 legislative session that involves a change to a reciprocity law involving military members, military spouses, some individuals who reside in Kansas, and select other individuals. Part of that passage of that bill, there was a report. That's an annual report the agency has to produce information for. We'll be preparing that report to have the information submitted to legislative research and the Division of Budget here in about the next month. In terms of some other updates for our operations, there was a significant bill that passed this legislative session concerning the BSRB. That was 2023 sub for Senate Bill 131. The majority of that bill was requested on behalf of the agency, had to do with a number of recommended changes to statutes by the board that were put into bill language, and then they were put through the legislative process to make changes to the statutes for the 7 professions that we regulate. Along that process, there were some items that were removed. There were some items that were added. The final bill includes very small sections relating to the Board of Healing Arts and the Board of Pharmacy, but the majority of that has to do with the BSRB. And so some of those items in the bill we were able to implement as of July 1st. And we did send a message out to all licensees at the end of June with some detailed information about new items that we could move forward on immediately. And then there were a handful of other items that required some additional approval and some work behind the scenes. So we're moving as fast as we can to implement the remaining items from the bill. But we're hoping to put out another announcement sometime in the next few weeks concerning new license types that were created by the bill and some other different modifications that should help individuals who are licensed or those that are seeking licensure. Part of the responsibilities that we received in that bill concerned our operations. And so in order to take care of the new responsibilities, the BSRB did get authority to hire 2 new licensing specialist positions. So one of the other things we've been doing the last few weeks has been interviewing candidates for those positions, and happy to report that I think we've identified some candidates for those positions. We will probably have some additional advertisements of positions, but we're hoping to get all of our positions filled probably in the next month. So we're really excited about the candidates who applied and moving forward in those directions. Adding new staff members should ensure that we have review of most applicants within a very short period of time. There are some candidates that have a more complicated review process, and we'll move forward on those as quickly as we're able to do so. But we're happy to bring on additional staff to make sure we can move things through as quickly as possible. In terms of some other items, I mentioned that one of our goals is to replace our existing paper records with electronic records. For those of you that have gone through that process, you know it's not a very easy or quick process, but it's a good one. And part of what we had moved forward on is last month, we made a request to the State Records Review Board to go ahead and reduce the amount of paper records that we're storing here on site in our office. As I mentioned, we only have 10 staff members, and so we have limited resources on just our storage in general. But our previous retention schedule indicated we would keep licensure records until expiration plus 10 years. And we requested a change to reduce that to expiration plus 2 years. And they approved that. We're in the process now of moving those 8 years of records to the Historical Society. They're not being destroyed. They're still considered a record for the process of being archived, but we'll be able to move them out, which will clear space for us to be able to use our space more effectively. The next step in the process will be that once we move those records, we're going to make a request to another body that deals with approval of electronic records. And we're hoping to make a request to convert our remaining records into electronic records. But doing it this way means that we will be converting up to expiration plus 2 years of records versus up to expiration and 10 years of records. So when we do convert to electronic, we'll have a lot fewer records to actually go and convert that process. So we're moving forward, but we're trying to do it efficiently and smart as we can. Additionally, another item that we are working on, every state agency has to submit a budget and revised estimates for the next fiscal year. And so last year we received a budget for fiscal year 2024, which is what we're currently in, state fiscal year 2024. However, we also submitted a request for a budget for FY 2025. And so this year by September 15th, we will make requested revisions to the amount for this year as well as the amount next year. And then between September 15th and the end of the year, Division of Budget will be reviewing our information, speaking with the governor's office. And then when the fiscal year starts, or when the calendar year starts next year in January, the governor will put out a governor's recommendation for all state agency budgets. And then in the spring, the legislature will consider our budget separately in the House and the Senate, and then ultimately will approve expenditure limitations for the agency for this year and next year. So that's just kind of a snapshot, but our main process right now is for the next month, we'll be working on making sure we have good estimates for expenditures as well as revenue coming in through the different licensure types that we oversee. Concerning some updates from the most recent board meeting, the board met on July 10th, 2023. There were 2 new board members, David Stevens, who you have gotten little to know at this meeting, and then also Linda Heitzman Powell, who was also a member of this advisory committee. Linda had previously served as a member of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, and she is licensed both as a behavior analyst and as a licensed psychologist. The governor did appoint David Stevens to be a new public member for the board, and then Linda Heitzman Powell to be a new member for the licensed psychology profession on the board, taking the spot that was previously held by Rick Steele. We do still expect to get 1 more board member appointed, and that is for the addiction counseling profession. Deb Stidham currently holds that role, and she's just finished her 2nd term. We expect the governor to make an appointment any day now, and we will keep you updated when we have information on that last board member appointee. In terms of some other items from the most recent board meeting, we have some proposed changes to regulations that are working their way through the process. We actually have 2 packets working their way through. One packet of proposed changes to regulations involves a number of fees for the BSRB. We had submitted fee modifications back at the beginning of this year, but then when the bill passed, Senate Bill 131, we pulled the regulation back, added the fees for that bill, and then submitted it through the process as a temporary regulation and as a permanent regulation. And so the fee regulation has worked its way to the process where it has been reviewed by the Department of Administration and then by the Attorney General's office, and it is currently out for public comment. Those proposed changes to the regulations are posted on the BSRB website. They have also been published in the Kansas Register, which is a publication from the Secretary of State's office. If you do have any public comment, I wanted to make you all aware there is an official open meeting on those proposed changes to regulations. That open meeting will be at the BSRB office on Tuesday, October 3rd from 10 a.m. until 11 p.m. The information for that meeting has also been in the Kansas Register and is on our website. So we are receiving public comment through writing, or people can show up to that meeting and share information if they have thoughts on the proposed changes to regulation. After that public meeting, we will approach the board with any public comment, and then the board will have the opportunity to formally adopt those regulations, and then they will be published in the Kansas Register. And after that time, and I believe 10 days, then they would become effective. And so just to let you know, a lot of those items relate to the bill that passed, for Senate Bill 131. There were also some other modifications. Earlier this spring, the board voted to reduce the fees for a number of our temporary licenses. The bill itself changed statutory language that increased the time for some of those temporary licenses. So the traditional temporary licenses would all be 2 years instead of some being 1 year, some being 2 years. But also the board separately had a recommendation to decrease the licensure fees for those temporary licenses so that they would all be $50. And so that is part of the changes. There is also a fee for individuals who are participating under the multi-state compact known as SIPAC, which is on your agenda. We'll talk about a little bit later, but that's a fee upon renewal. If individuals are practicing under SIPAC authority, there is a fee that the BSRB will charge on renewal. It's a $25 fee, and it is primarily intended to help us recoup the cost of the yearly assessment that SIPAC charges the BSRB for those individuals who are practicing under SIPAC authority. In terms of some other updates, I wanted to let you know a lot of the annual meetings for different associations will be taking place over the next few months. For psychology, the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB, is holding their annual meeting in Cleveland on September 27th through October 1st. I will be attending that meeting, as well as Richard Nobles and Linda Heitzman Powell. And so that's a good opportunity for us to have an opportunity to voice our thoughts in the discussion as far as any items that are being considered by ASPPB, and also to learn about any of the different movements that are happening in different states, any of the issues they're experiencing that we can get out in front, or any of the solutions that they have been able to work through that we can bring to Kansas. Additionally, in terms of some other updates, I did want to let you know that the board is looking at language for an RFP to begin an impaired provider program that the board would be able to utilize as needed for situations in which some individuals that are licensed by the board may be in need of services from such a program. The Board of Nursing and some of the other professional associations are able to utilize that here in Kansas, but the BSRB has not previously entered into an agreement with a group for that. So we're looking at language for that. We are also, the board is having conversations on establishing an expedited license review process. The board had some good discussion on that at the last board meeting. We're still working through the logistics, but we're going to bring back some draft language for the board at the next board meeting. And then also, the board is planning to have an off-site planning meeting. Once a year, the board seeks to meet in person and have sort of an all-day meeting to review any items that could be appropriate for a legislative agenda or any items that would require a kind of a lengthy discussion to work through. So that meeting is scheduled to take place on Monday, October 23rd, from about 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. in Wichita. It will be at Watson Park at the Seasons venue. And we're going to put more information on the BSRB website. That is an open meeting, so anyone who's in the Wichita area interested in attending the meeting that day is welcome to come to the meeting. But that'll be an opportunity for the board to meet in person that day and work through a number of different items. And then just one last item. This is an item for future meetings. We do get conversations from individuals from the public at times. Recently, I did get communication to me from an individual who is asking if the advisory committee could revisit a topic that was discussed last year, which had to do with some of the requirements for individuals seeking licensure who did not come from a program that is approved by the American Psychological Association. Last year, a lot of the advisory committees reviewed some of the alternate requirements for licensure. These are called substantially equivalent requirements. And one of them for some of the professions requires that the individual have attained certain education while they were in residence, while they were physically present at an institution. And some of the different committees have had a conversation about changing that to make it all available either in person or by screen, face-to-face. And I believe there was a conversation in this committee, and we also collected some information from educators as well. And so a member from the public asked if the committee could consider having further discussion on that sometime later this year. And so I wanted to bring that to your attention as a possible topic for the future. And speaking of educators, one other item the BSRB is working on. In the past, several years back, the BSRB has had an educator forum where we have had sort of an open house where members of different colleges and universities have been able to participate in a roundtable discussion. And so we are seeking to start that again. We are looking at possible dates in October to invite any members that are staff of different colleges and universities to come to the BSRB. We're probably going to have that as a hybrid meeting, in person and remote. And it'll be an opportunity for us to kind of speak on some of the legislative items the board has worked on recently, some of the changes to regulations that are proposed or have been discussed, and then also the ability to answer questions from those individuals as well. And then we've also heard interest in having a similar open roundtable for employers. And so we are looking at possibly having a meeting like that as well, perhaps in October, just to be able to inform those groups as well in terms of the different things the board has worked on the last couple of years, and then also to answer any questions from those groups as well. We started a process about 2.5 years ago with our launch of the YouTube channel, broadcasting all of our meetings, trying to make sure good information was posted on our website. And part of that was an outreach effort to make sure that people who were interested in the board's work were able to find that information more easily and more accessibly. And so if we can do further outreach, Leslie and I currently talk to different universities and different groups of students, but we're always interested in sharing more information with the public as well. So with that, I will go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
Any questions for David regarding his report? Seeing or hearing none, we'll move on to topic 7, and that is the matter of training for board members and advisory committee members.
Thank you, Richard. So the next topic will have to do with training for board members and advisory committee members. This is an annual training that we have put together. So part of this training is intended for board members, part of it is intended for advisory committee members, but we walk through the same information. And part of that is because some of you on the advisory committee may someday become board members. Linda, you have some experience with that, as serving as an advisory committee member and then becoming a board member, and others have in the past as well. But also it's really helpful, I think, for advisory committee members to understand their role as it relates to the work of the board. Your work on the advisory committee is to assist the work on the board and to put forward recommendations, but ultimately it's the board that has authority to really recommend changes to statutes and regulations. And so we're going to cover some of those materials. You have in your packet of material 3 different documents. One is called Expectations of Board Members. It's a policy that has been adopted by the board. There's also a document that has to do with the advisory committee policy. And then you have a 3rd document, which has to do with expectations for public attendees. That was created to try to give members of the public a little bit more information about the meetings that we hold, and then some of those topics that are good for discussion. And so we also have some information as part of this training that has been influenced by legal counsel for the board. And so the training is fairly lengthy, but I think it's a lot of good information. So I will go through this pretty fast. Now I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides. When I have those up, I probably won't be able to see your hand if you have a question. So if you do have a question, feel free to voice it during the training or hold it until the end. But if you do voice it during the meeting, go ahead and unmute yourself and then just go ahead and say what the question is. And now I will share my screen. Okay, can you all see the slides for the training? Okay, great. Well, this is the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, also the BSRB, and this is our annual training. Just to kind of start from a good high-level view, the mission of the BSRB, in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature, is to protect and serve the consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulations. And we accomplish this through the efficiency, fairness, and respect to all those involved. A little bit of the history of the BSRB. We were created in 1980 when the Kansas legislature created the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. The existing Board of Psychology examiners and the social work examiners were combined, and then over the years, more professions have joined. For example, those ones that have joined over the years include professional counselors, master's level psychologists, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and behavior analysts. What we have in Kansas is commonly referred to in other states as a composite board. Rather than have a separate board for psychologists, separate board for social workers, professional counselors, etc., there is one board, and that is composed of professional members and public members. And this combination of individuals on one board is referred to as a composite board. Some of the benefits of having a composite board is by utilizing this structure and this model, the agency saves a significant amount of operational expenses by sharing resources and utilizing licensing and investigative staff for similar subjects. One of the ways to understand the role of the board is to differentiate it from an association. A regulatory board exists to protect the consumers. It's created by the legislature and it's governed by statute, otherwise called laws. An association exists to enhance the profession and is created by members of the profession. In terms of the role of the BSRB, we are an agency that employs 10 staff members, and that includes myself. We have an executive director. Leslie Allen is the assistant director and licensing manager. We also have licensing specialists. We have 2 individuals who serve as investigators for the board, and then we also have clerical employees. We are what is known as a fee-funded agency. We do not receive funding from the state general fund, but by statute, we contribute 10% of all of our revenue we receive up to a cap of $100,000 per year. Agency revenue is primarily from license fees, and our annual budget is about $1.1 million per year. As a small agency, we contract with and have agreements with many other agencies and other entities to make sure we have services. All board members are appointed by the governor to serve a 4-year term and may be reappointed for a second term, allowing for service on the board a maximum of 8 consecutive years. The board composition is as follows: 2 psychologists, and those are licensed psychologists, 2 social workers, 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 professional counselor, 1 addiction counselor, 1 master's level psychologist, and 4 public members. In terms of a very high level view, the BSRB really has 2 main functions. One is licensing, and the other is investigation of complaints or discipline against practitioners. Currently, there are about 15,155 active permanent licenses under the BSRB, and those are in the 7 professions that I've mentioned previously. A further breakdown by profession and level of license you can see on this. This reflects some of the numbers that we provide to the board at every full board meeting. The largest profession by total number of licenses is the social work profession, which has about 59% or 60% of our total licenses. The largest group of licensees is the master's level social work, but the clinical level social work is the next highest. In terms of some of the other professions, you can kind of see the breakdown there between the clinical level of licensure versus the non-clinical for those that have that. For your profession, there are about 1,034 individuals with an active license in licensed psychology. In terms of new licenses, this past fiscal year 23 that just ended at the end of June, we issued 1,586 new permanent licenses, 433 new temporary licenses, and 66 out-of-state temporary permits. Of the 1,586 permanent licenses issued by the board, about 2/3, 1,124 were initial licenses, whereas about 462, or about 1/3, were through reciprocity, individuals who are licensed in other states that are coming to practice in Kansas. In terms of our renewal information, so since we just started the next fiscal year, we are still pulling some information in some of the categories. So I wanted to provide some information to you. So this is from the year before, but last fiscal year in 2022, we processed 6,214 license renewals. As part of the license renewal process, 10% of all applicants are audited, and that is to ensure they've met the continuing education requirements. In FY 2022, the BSRB audited 625 individuals. And if you're curious why that number is not just 10% of the total, there are some individuals that specifically come up for audit because of past disciplinary reasons. In terms of licensing trends, since July of 2015, the number of permanent licensees has increased by about 24.7%, from 12,152 to 15,155. For comparison, over that time frame, the population in Kansas has increased between 1% and 2%. And so in terms of population growth compared to number of total licensees, we've had a lot larger of an increase in licensees that are licensed in the different professions we regulate. The professions with the largest increases are professional counseling, social work, and behavior analysis. In terms of the other function the board provides, investigation and discipline, as a public protection agency, the BSRB investigates complaints against practitioners under the authority of the board. The agency has administrative authority over practitioners, but this process does not take the place of criminal proceedings or civil proceedings. Sometimes when we get requests to investigate a matter, there could be something that appears to be more of a criminal matter, so we always make sure to clarify our authority does not take the place of that, and it may be suitable for them to contact law enforcement. Further, we are also not a party in terms of a civil lawsuit. We are not here to facilitate individuals who want to sue each other. Our main priority is administrative authority over individuals who are licensed and their responsibility as a licensed professional in the state of Kansas. In FY 2023, the BSRB received about 200 complaints. We call them also report of alleged violations against practitioners. For comparison, practitioners received 205 complaints the previous fiscal year, 132 complaints in FY 2021, 199 complaints in FY 20, and 201 complaints in FY 2019. You may be wondering why there was such a big dip in fiscal year 2021. That was some of the earlier stages of the pandemic. And while I can't tell you for sure why that decreased so significantly, I can tell you that is consistent in talking to other states. They also saw a decrease during that time period. It is possible that because of limitations on in-person visits, some individuals may not have been receiving the same level of care. Other individuals may have been shifting to telepractice and may not have been familiar with what the accepted level of care was. And so they were happy just to get any types of services, but unsure what was accepted practice or what was not. But there's a lot of theories on why that number dipped. I can just tell you that it's not unusual compared to other states. In terms of our investigative process, complaints are reviewed to determine whether the BSRB has jurisdiction over the issue and whether the matter involves a potential violation of the statutes and regulations for the profession. One item that has to do with jurisdiction, we do not regulate psychiatrists. Psychiatrists, because of their medical degree, are overseen by the Board of Healing Arts. Also, because of the states that we border, there could be some individuals in Kansas City, Missouri, and there could be some confusion if this person is licensed in Kansas or Missouri. So occasionally we have to defer to other groups. But Complaints or RAVs, if we do have jurisdiction, and if all things are true, if that could be a violation, then they are reviewed by a subset of the board that's called the Complaint Review Committee, or the CRC. Common violations that we see, including falsifying continuing education requirements. We find these during audits. Some individuals practice without a license or practice after their license is expired. There also have been dual relationships that could involve conflicts of interest, making sexual advances towards or engaging in physical intimacies with any client, refusing to report termination or suspension, confidentiality violations, or other practice issues, such as performing services inconsistent with one's education or accepted professional standards. In terms of outreach, that is another function that Leslie Allen and I and other members of the staff perform. Leslie and I do speak with groups of students at different schools to provide information on licensing and disciplinary matters, to provide a proactive approach to assist individuals before they become licensed. And we're still pulling the numbers from this past year, but in FY 2022, we provided 18 presentations. Also, I mentioned too, the BSRB launched a YouTube to broadcast board meetings and advisory committee meetings. That was started in January of 2021, shortly after I became the executive director for the agency. Currently, we have broadcast, I think now at 124 or 125 board meetings or advisory committee meetings that have been either live or uploaded after the fact. Those have been viewed over 4,300 times. I have heard that in past years, the board and advisory committees may have had around 10, maybe 15 tops in terms of public attendees over the course of the year. So I think I'm very proud of the number that we have in terms of individuals who have viewed our meetings. I think it has led to more interaction from our staff in terms of questions from the public, and also individuals being more educated about the work that we're doing here in the board office, and then also the topics that were being discussed by the advisory committees as well. We also have a resource that is going to be a good resource for all of you as advisory committee members too, a BSRB website, which is ksbsrb.ks.gov. We do have lots of different items on the website that are helpful when you're becoming knowledgeable in your role as an advisory committee member. Some of the features on the website that can be helpful to you include a portal to renew licenses when you're renewing your own license. We also have copies of forms and other applicant materials when individuals are seeking licensure. We link to copies of the statutes from the Reviser of Statutes office and also the regulations, which are posted by the Secretary of State. We also list proposed changes to statutes and regulations when we have bills in front of the legislature. Those are proposed changes to statutes. Currently, I mentioned we have some proposed changes to regulations, and so you can review those. Also, we post the complaint / report of alleged violation forms if you do need to submit a complaint against a practitioner. We also post public disciplinary orders on the BSRB website. So if you're interested in looking to see any individuals who receive public discipline, those are posted as well after there are some redactions. Additionally, there's information on board and advisory committee meetings. There's a separate page for each of the advisory committees, and we post the materials that we provide to you so that other people can review those and participate in the meeting electronically as well. In terms of expectations of board members, so I mentioned in your packet of material, there were some documents for you to review. One was a policy the board created several years ago and then just revised about a year ago. And this has to do with formal expectations of board members. It's posted on the BSRB website under our policies. The authority of this document, insofar as the expectations for board members conflicts with or limits the federal or state statute or regulation, the statute or regulation controls. And what that means is that our policy documents are not to take the place of law. They're to be helpful, but if they have a conflict, law will be a higher level of standard. In terms of the guiding principles of the board, persons in Kansas shall expect that licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional. Persons regulated by the BSRB shall expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulation. The BSRB shall provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost efficient, courteous, and competent. The BSRB shall be guided and led by ethical principles, clear policies, progressive thinking, and strategic decision making. The BSRB shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. In terms of services provided by the agency, we are to process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner. We are to take disciplinary action when appropriate. We are to provide timely information to the public, and we are to maintain rules and regulations and statutes. The policy for board members does include a code of conduct. The first item that's discussed under that section is integrity. A board member of the BSRB should have no criminal or professional misconduct record, nor commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. A board member of the BSRB possesses sound moral principles, for example, is upright, honest, or sincere. Board members of the BSRB should have courage of convictions to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda. And a board member of the BSRB should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside of the boardroom. A board member of the BSRB should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions in those areas of interest. A board member of the BSRB should not represent their personal opinion of that of the board. A board member of the BSRB should be limited to 1 unexcused absence per year. The second item, it deals with conflicts of interest. A board member of the BSRB should guard against conflicts of interest. Under compliance, common components of conflicts of interest policy includes, but is not limited to, some or all of the following. A board member of the BSRB should have no personal financial benefit as a result of service to the BSRB, except that there is sustenance and mileage in terms of reimbursement. A board member of the BSRB who may have a conflict of interest according to stated criteria should refrain from voting on the matter. A board member of the BSRB should disclose any relationship with any agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving such conflict. Now, for this item, I know sometimes there are questions from members of the advisory committee or the board that say, well, I belong to an association that may have a similar interest as the board. Do I need to avoid voting on those types of matters? And really, that's up to the call of the board member. We don't expect you not to serve on those associations. We realize that there is a community of mental health professionals here in Kansas, and it's normal to be involved in those activities. The question really would be, do you think your membership in that group would bias your ability to keep the board's goals and agenda for the public protection? If it conflicts with that and you don't think you'd be able to separate those two, then you should basically announce that you may have a conflict of interest and then just recuse yourself from that vote. And if you have a question about it, it's always good to err on the side of caution just to avoid a conflict of interest or even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And in terms of other conflicts of interest, a board member of the BSRB serving as part of an organization working in any way with the BSRB should inform the board chair. A board member of the BSRB should not accept gifts or promotional items received as part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use. A board member of the BSRB should not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. And then the next item is confidentiality. Board discussion involving any of the following matters shall remain confidential unless the board expressly agrees to the contrary. The first is any discussion that occurs during an executive session, and 2, any discussion concerning actual or potential litigation. And if there is something that will be confidential, we will try to make that very clear. As I mentioned before, our meetings are broadcast. So all of the items we're talking about right now, this is all public information. The board does have authority, and the advisory committee have authority as well, to go into executive session for a limited number of reasons. And if they do go into executive session, that is confidential. It is away from the public meeting. And often the reasons that people would go into executive session do relate to personnel issues or potential litigation or other matters like that. But we will make it very clear if there's any items we discuss that would be confidential. In terms of the board chair and the authority of that individual, the chair of the board presides at all meetings, appoints members to the advisory committees, appoints members to the complaint review committee or the CRC, and appoints members to other ad hoc committees. The vice chair shall discharge the duties of the chair in his or her absence, disability, resignation, or death. And then in terms of the role of the executive director for the agency, in the event that that person is unable to perform the duties of the executive director, the BSRB may request an interim director. If the BSRB is unable to meet immediately, the board chair will seek an interim director until the board can meet. In terms of the structure with the executive director relationship with the board, so the executive director will communicate any personnel matters that specifically need to be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. And then the chair of the board will present those board-related issues to the board, and the executive director will communicate to the staff the board wishes, intention, and policies, etc. And that last item we take care of here internally with about monthly staff meetings where I talk to my staff and keep them up to date with any items from the board. In terms of delegation to me in my role as executive director, The executive director is the administrative head of the organization, serving at all times under the board. The executive director is responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board. He is to assist in the developing of the overall program and shall recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board. Also, the executive director shall have the sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. Just to let you all know, if I ever want to hire someone or set their amount at a salary or do any kind of salary increases, all of those do have to be submitted to the governor's office, and the governor does have the authority to approve or reject me hiring any specific person or to reject any kind of salary that I might request for that individual. So there is some oversight on that process. In terms of executive expectations, the executive director shall keep the board advised of BSRB activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. The executive director shall prepare the agenda for board meetings in consultation with the board chair. The executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for its annual meeting, which is sometimes referred to as the retreat, which shall allow for issues before the board that need in-depth consideration. And then it talks a little bit about monitoring of the executive director's performance. It says the board shall, when necessary, utilize executive session to discuss issues concerning the executive director. The board shall also formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereafter, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained. And that is something the board does. They give me a yearly performance review. And in my role as executive director, I also do that for my staff members as well. In terms of the advisory committee, the advisory committee's role is to assist the work of the board. The board utilizes 7 standing advisory committees, 1 for each of the 7 professions regulated by the board. The advisory committee policy is posted on the board's website, and you received a copy of that policy in your materials. Currently, there's about 53 individuals who volunteer to serve on these advisory committees that are separate from the actual board members. The advisory committee purpose. A BSRB advisory committee, as a creation of the board, has the purpose of supporting the board in carrying out its mission to protect the public. Members serve at the pleasure of the board. Actions pertaining to informing, licensing, and disciplining of those persons regulated by the board are the methods for accomplishing that mission. An advisory committee fulfills its purpose by addressing issues referred to it by the board through the advisory committee chair or the executive director. A committee may suggest issues it believes the board should consider by referring those through the chair of the advisory committee. The advisory committee process. If an item is referred to the board from the advisory committee, the board really has 3 options. 1, to agree the issue needs to be addressed at the board level. 2, agree the issue should be addressed and refer the matter to an appropriate person or committee for additional information, review, or analysis, which will then be brought back to the board. Or 3, decide not to address the issue. In terms of the structure of the advisory committee, chairs of advisory committees will be members of the board. If the profession is represented on the board, the chair of the advisory committee will be a board member licensed in the discipline of the committee and appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board. Any other board members appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board will serve as a member of that advisory committee. A public member of the board will also be a member. There will be a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 additional members appointed. The executive director will be a non-voting ex officio member. The assistant director or licensing manager is encouraged to attend, and legal counsel representing the board should attend meetings, but only when their attendance is requested. In terms of the structure of the advisory committee, so terms of advisory committee members will be 2 years. They will be appointed by the chair of the BSRB, and they can serve up to 4 years. So a total of potentially 8 years on the advisory committee. Appointments to the committee should be staggered to avoid having too many members of the committee reach their maximum length of service at the same time. There is some language in the policy that says the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will also apply to the advisory committee members. The reason that is bold and italicized is because if you're really wondering about your role as an advisory committee member, part of that is helpful to look at the expectations of board members document, because there are some differences in board members versus advisory committee members' responsibilities. But in general, those policies and procedures, as we talk about things like conflicts of interest and other items similar to that in the that policy for board members, you should be mindful of as well to make sure that you're fulfilling your responsibility appropriately. In terms of individuals coming off the advisory committee, most can come off the committee after the terms have ended, or they resign their position if they decide to step down early. But the chair of the BSRB can also remove members from the advisory committee. In terms of selection of advisory committee members, members of the committee may be nominated by anyone, including the public, committee members, members of the professional organization, either through the discipline's own or others, or through self-nomination. In reviewing nominations, the committee works to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity. And members should provide representation to the levels of licensing for that discipline, and those members should be selected from among public and private practitioners, as well as educators. The committee as a whole discusses nominations and reaches recommendations on new members. The nominee's resume, a letter stating the reasons why he or she desires to be appointed, and a copy of the board's mission to which and goals to which the nominee has indicated agreement are reviewed. The chair of the committee will submit the committee's recommendation for new members to the BSRB board chair. The chair will review the recommendations and may request input before making a decision, which will be announced at a board meeting. After the appointment has been approved by the executive director, the executive director will inform the advisory committee appointee by letter or email. The executive director may assist the new member by providing information, which will help orient the member to the board and the advisory committee's roles and functions. And then the third document I referenced, guidelines for attendees of meetings. This is an official policy posted to the BSRB website. It clarifies that public comment is not entitled to individuals, but could be approved. It outlines that processes should be followed during comments to the board and advisory committee members, and it also discusses the topics relevant for public comment to the board and the advisory committees. It clarifies the board wants to receive valid complaints against practitioners and provides information on how those complaints are to be submitted, but informs potential attendees that certain matters concerning specific licensees will be considered in a closed, standardized process to ensure fairness to members of the public as well as licensees. And then I'm going to transition to some general training here for professional licensing boards. Some of this has been influenced by legal counsel over the years, but I think it's really helpful information to kind of understand some of the general rules in terms of the Kansas Open Meeting Act, Kansas Open Records Act, and then also philosophically your role as a member, either as a board member or an advisory committee member. So in terms of professional licensing boards, the state of Kansas regulates many professions. Each of these professions is regulated by a licensing board or commission that was created by the Kansas legislature for the purpose of ensuring that licensed professionals are competent and do not pose a risk to the public. A professional licensing board is created by enabling legislation, which establishes the board's mission, form, mission, powers, functions, tools of implementation, and enforcement abilities. A board is considered to be a creature of statute, meaning a board's power is dependent upon its authorizing statutes, and therefore any exercise of authority claimed by the board must come from those statutes, either explicitly or necessarily implied. Also, a board may administer, implement, and enforce only those statutes. If those statutes are silent on a particular action, the board lacks authority to take such action. Simply put, a board can do only what the statutes say it can do. Besides the statute specific to a board's authority is limited by certain constitutional protections, such as the constitutional equal protection and due process rights. These prohibit a board from acting in a way which results in disparate or inconsistent treatment of persons that are similarly situated, from adopting different standards for similar situations, or otherwise acting arbitrarily, capriciously, or vindictively. For example, a licensing board may not impose more severe discipline on male licensees solely because of their gender, or a licensing board may not revoke a license simply because the board is not like that person. Other constitutional guarantees, such as freedom of speech, rights to privacy, unreasonable search and seizure, and vagueness also establish parameters of the board's authority. The Kansas legislature retains control over the BSRB in terms of certain aspects, such as one, the legislature could modify our legislation, which would change the purpose of the board. They could also limit expenditures in an appropriations bill. We operate based on a limit they set, and if they change that, it would impact our operations and our ability to function. The legislature could also enact new legislation to change the makeup, scope, or the powers of the board. In order to carry out our purpose, a board is granted or delegated powers and functions that somewhat parallel the three-level branches of government the executive, judicial, and the legislative. In terms of our executive authority, we carry out the Enabling Act and the legislation that has been passed. We follow the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA. We also follow the Kansas Open Records Act, or KORA. In terms of our judicial authority, we have quasi-judicial hearings when we're reviewing facts when a violation of law has occurred. So that would be involving disciplinary type matters. We also follow the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, also called CAPA, when appropriate. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Legislative authority, and that's also our kind of administrative authority, and that has to do with our ability to adopt regulations to implement or interpret the Enabling Act with more detailed or specific requirements. This process involves holding an open hearing on proposed regulations, allowing feedback, and there's also oversight by a legislative committee. In order to fulfill its responsibility to protect the public from incompetent, unprofessional, and unauthorized practitioners, a regulatory board implements and enforces statutes and regulations, and at times operates according to internal policies. In order to be effective, board members need to understand the differences between statutes, regulations, and policies. So first, we've talked a little bit about statutes so far, but statutes really are laws passed by the Kansas legislature through authority derived from the Kansas Constitution and subsequently signed by the governor. Statutes generally become effective on July 1st of that session, but can become effective if a different date is specified in the legislation. Statutes set the parameters of the board's authority. Statutes also control any inconsistent regulation or policy. The board becomes dissatisfied with the scope of its authority. For example, the board determines that it needs investigative subpoena authority. The board must seek legislation in order to accomplish its goal by changing the law. Whereas regulations, on the other hand, are adopted by a board to further implement or carry out the purpose of a particular statute. The board's authority to adopt regulations is derived from statute. In adopting rules and regulations, the board follows the Rules and Regulations Filing Act to ensure the process of adopting regulations is open, receptive to public and legislative input, and addresses the economic impact of board and those affected. The regulations themselves are consistent in style, organization, and grammar, are lawful, and are filed and published. Regulations are also promulgated to complete or fill in details of a statutory scheme, implement statutes, and affect rights or responsibilities of third parties outside of the board. When adopted in accordance with the Rules and Regulations Filing Act, regulations have the force and effect of law, such as they are legally enforceable. To be valid, a regulation must be within the statutory authority conferred upon the board, implement a specific statute, or otherwise pass a test of legality. Any regulation that goes beyond the authority granted violates an enabling statute or is inconsistent with the statutory power of the board, another statute, or the Constitution will be found void. In terms of policies, policies may be adopted by a board only to guide its internal operations, such as prioritizing staff workload or explaining the investigative process. Guidance documents are documents that state a board's current approach to or interpretation of law, or general statements of policy that describe how and when the board will exercise discretionary functions. In terms of items to look at when determining how to be an effective board member or an effective advisory committee member, we would recommend that you read the board's enabling statutes, and those are found under KSA 74-7501. Those are linked from the board's website under the statutes for the profession. It's also recommended that you read through the board's licensing act, which is also included in the statutes on the board's website. It's a good idea to also read the regulations that correspond to each licensing act. For your advisory committee, I would recommend just the ones for the licensed psychology, but if you want to read others, feel free. And then also reading the BSRB policies that are posted on the BSRB website. Please be alert for agency policies and internal procedures which may be inconsistent with or conflict with the board statutes and regulations, or which affect requirements for applicants or licensees. Be willing to initiate action to amend statutes or modify regulations. And I will let you know, we had a significant bill that I've referenced a few times, that Senate Bill 131. Some of the regulations that need to be modified have to do with changes that would be consistent with the passage of that bill. We are going to be going through a process of looking through the regulations to make sure we're updating those so that the terminology is consistent with the bill that just passed. If a statute or regulation seems confusing or vague, it could appear that way to individuals who must comply with them. Remember, the purpose of imposing discipline against licensees is to encourage compliance with the law and protect the public. Discipline should not be vindictive or disproportionate to the severity of the violation. Always be mindful that the role of the board is to protect the public, not the licensees. In terms of conflicts of interest typically mean having any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business or transaction or professional activity, or incurring any obligation of any nature which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board members' duties in the public interest. Board members or advisory committee members must make public and recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that exists to ensure the integrity of the board and all its decisions. Disclosure and recusal are important tools to avoid actual or perceived conflicts of interest, but board members must not overuse recusals as an excuse to avoid conflicts in exercising their full responsibilities. Some of the types of conflicts of interest have to do with personal conflicts, and those are those actions that may ultimately have a personal consequence that is a direct or indirect effect of a decision or action. No decisions should be made that will advance the personal benefit of the board member or advisory committee member. Some examples of personal conflicts could be personal gain, bias, or the effects on a personal relationship. In terms of confidentiality, at all times, a board member or advisory committee member must conform to the rules of confidentiality and dealings outside the boardroom. Protected information obtained in the capacity of board membership or advisory committee membership must remain confidential during and after that membership terminates. Termination of that membership does not dissolve the board member or advisory committee member from that responsibility. The rules that applied during active board membership continue to apply after termination of the membership. Confidentiality must be maintained on all confidential subjects that the individual was privy to as a board member. Some examples of times when confidential information could be discussed. We've talked a little bit about executive sessions that occur when an open meeting goes into executive session. Or there could also be deliberations after a hearing. Now, this is more likely to occur for board members, but if there are their public hearing under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, the COMA, and the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act is what guides the board to deliberate in a private session in order to reach a decision on a pending case. And that could be a decision involving licensure of a particular applicant or a disciplinary matter. In terms of professional activities, a board member may hold an office in a professional or trade association of the regulated profession, but may not lobby for or cast votes regarding a matter that would impact the professional association or the board member's office in that association. The board member may not use his or her position on the board to further the interest of the professional association or his or her office in that association. Board members may attend professional conferences and social events, but they must be mindful of open meetings, rules, and conflicts of interest. If a majority of board members are present, do not discuss the business or affairs of the board to avoid triggering a, quote, meeting under the COMA. Additionally, do not discuss matters related to a particular pending application or a disciplinary matter of a specific person. In terms of other conduct, a board member should not represent himself or herself as a spokesperson for the board unless authorized by the vote of the board to speak on the board's behalf. If a board member is asked to give the board's position on an issue and the board does not authorize that member to do so, the board member must decline to comment or make clear that any opinions expressed are those of him or her alone and not of the board. A board member should not ask board staff or board counsel to provide legal advice or preferential treatment to any applicant or licensee. Under the COMA, the Kansas Open Meeting Act, it allows the public to observe governmental entities making decisions. Meetings shall be open to the public because, according to the statute, a representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. Because the purpose of COMA is to benefit the public, it is interpreted liberally and exceptions are applied narrowly to carry out its purpose. The COMA applies to all legislative and administrative bodies and agencies of the state and other subordinate groups, therefore receiving or expending and supported in part or in whole public funds. The COMA does not define the term subordinate groups, but if created by a covered entity and the group has become an extension of the covered entity, most likely the subordinate group is covered by the COMA, which is why advisory committee members do fall under COMA. The COMA does not apply to an otherwise covered entity when exercising a quasi-judicial function or conducting a proceeding or hearing under the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act or the CAPA. COMA also does not apply to the judiciary, private organization, or staff meetings of a covered entity. A meeting is defined as any gathering or assembly in person through the use of a telephone or other medium for interactive communication by a majority of membership of an agency or public body subject to the act for the purpose of discussing the business or affairs of the public body or agency. And this is one item that I think I get a lot of questions about for new members of the advisory committee, because they don't want to violate coma, which is very good. And there can be some confusion about what really constitutes a meeting. And so it's not always one of these official meetings that we have. This is why we don't have members communicate back and forth with the whole group by email, because that would constitute a meeting if it's interactive discussion back and forth, even though it's electronic and not an in-person meeting or a remote meeting. And also you need to look for if you have a majority of members of the group. Sometimes when we in these trainings, members of the advisory committee think, well, this seems like I can't reach out to any specific member of the group if I have a question. But you can communicate back and forth with other members of the advisory committee, and you can talk about advisory committee work. It's just you need to make sure that you don't involve a majority of members of the group outside of a public meeting. So you can communicate back and forth, and you can always reach out to me if you have questions on that. I'm happy to clarify. And then further, you may be at a social function or other event where a majority of board members are there because of the common values and goals. And that's okay. You can be in a gathering that has a majority of members of the board. You just need to refrain from discussing board business, because those three things in combination is really what would get people into trouble. So just make sure that you're mindful not to discuss items that could be considered business of the board. Otherwise, if you're all together or communicating back and forth, there's a majority of members, and it's for the purpose of discussing the business or affairs of the BSRB or the advisory committee, then you could run into an issue with the COMA. And just a little bit further detail, meetings can be conducted by telephone or other electronic mediums such as Zoom, which we're using right now, Skype, etc., other items like that. If the board complies with all the COMA requirements, a meeting includes informal discussions before and after the public meeting, or during a recess of a public meeting, in all gatherings at all stages of the decision-making process. The name of the gathering is irrelevant, thus we could call it a work session or a retreat, but those are still subject to COMA if those requirements are in place. A discussion does not require binding action or voting. A discussion can occur at social gatherings, retreats, and meetings held in private, education conferences, or seminars. Thus, when traveling to such meetings, members of the board should avoid discussing business or affairs of the agency. In terms of the COMA, the presiding officer has the duty to provide notice of the meeting, but this duty may be delegated. The BSRB, we provide notice of all of the open meetings. We put those on the public square. We also put them on our website, and then we send out a message to anyone who has requested notice of such meetings. According to the COMA, it does not require notice of meetings to be published in a paper or on a website, but we do that as a service. And an individual must request notice of meetings. There are no formalities to requesting notice that can be verbal or written. So we do keep a list of those individuals who have requested notice of our meetings. The notice must provide the date, time, and location where the body will meet for the person requesting notice in a reasonable time before the meeting. A request is valid for 1 fiscal year, and the board must notify a requester of expiration before terminating notice to that requester. The COMA does not address meeting procedures, so a board is not required to follow Robert's Rules of Order, for example, or any similar formal rules of procedure. The COMA does not require a board to create an agenda, but if one exists, it must be made available to everyone. A person may record the meeting if doing so is not disruptive, and the public body does not have the right, or the public does not have the right to speak at those meetings, but only to listen and observe. The board cannot vote by secret ballot. A board policy may require minutes to be kept, but the COMA does not require the board to have minutes unless there is a motion to go into executive session. The motion as made must be included in the minutes. An executive session permits discussion of certain enumerated matters outside of public view. To take an executive session, the board must first convene an open meeting. The board cannot take binding action in an executive session, but is able to reach a consensus. If a consensus is achieved, the board must reconvene the open meeting and take a formal vote in an open session. If there are any violations, prosecutions under the COMA are civil, not criminal. Any person, county district attorney, or the attorney general may bring an action in district court. The county/district attorney and attorney general have subpoena power, and enforcement actions take precedence over all our cases and are assigned for trial at the earliest practical date. These do not come up often, but I think it's important for you to kind of have a better understanding of the COMA. The remedies for a COMA violation include voiding any action taken if prosecuted by the attorney general or county district attorney only, an injunction stopping an action, mandamus forcing an action, or a declaratory judgment. Penalties for COMA violations include a fine up to $500 per board member, not the board, for each violation: ouster from office, recall from office, court costs assessed to the person seeking enforcement of coma, court costs assessed against plaintiff if maintained action previously, not in good faith or without reasonable basis in law or facts. So that is coma. If you do have any questions on the coma, please let me know. And I will let you know, this PowerPoint is fairly lengthy, so we could not send it out, but we will post it to the BSRB website. And I will let you all know when that's posted so that you can refresh your memory and go through this at your leisure if you'd like to do that. You can also watch the YouTube version of this training, and you're happy to go through and kind of listen to any of this again if you'd like to do so. Shifting now to the Kansas Open Records Act, or the KORA. The Kansas Open Records Act requires the board to have its records, quote, open for inspection by any person unless otherwise provided, and KORA shall be liberally construed and applied to promote such policy. A public agency includes the state or any other political or taxing subdivision of the state, or any office, officer, agency, or instrumentality thereof, or any other entity receiving, expending, or supported in whole or in part by public funds appropriated by the state or political taxing subdivision. The term instrumentality is not defined in KORA. Nevertheless, if created by a covered entity or the group has become an extension of a covered entity, will most likely be covered. A public agency does not include private companies, even if they receive public funds in exchange for goods and services. It does not include judges and courts, an individual legislator or member of a governing body, private individuals, or state employees. A public record includes any recorded information regardless of form or characteristics, which is made, maintained, or kept by, or is in the possession of any public agency, and written records, photographs, computer data, and email. A public record does not include records that are owned by a private person or entity and are not related to functions, activities, programs, or operations funded by public funds, or records not in the existence at the time of the request. The board is not required to create a record in order to fulfill a request. Under the KORA, the board must appoint a Freedom of Information officer to assist with KORA requests, and Leslie Allen from our office assists with those requests. We must display, distribute, or otherwise make available a brochure describing requester rights, agency responsibilities, and procedures for inspecting or obtaining copies of public records. We do have a policy specifically on public records that's posted on our website. We also have a paper form that's available if individuals walk in person and request more information on this topic. We also must include the name, title of a records custodian, fees, and office hours available for anyone to make a request, and all of that is included in the document that we have available. In Kansas, any person may make a request. The person need not be a resident or provide a reason for their request. The board may require the request to be in writing, state the name and address for the requester, provide proof or identification, and sign a written certification that the requester will not use the names and addresses obtained from the records to solicit sales or services. Unless closed by law, the board cannot deny a person the right to review his public records. For instance, copyrighted material may not be reproduced without the permission of the copyright holder, but must be made available for viewing or listening. If portions of a record are closed, the remainder of the record must be made available to the requester, this referred to as a redaction. The board is not required to make copies of a recording of tapes or discs, videotapes or films, pictures, slides, graphics, illustrations, unless shown at a public meeting. The request must be acted upon as soon as possible, but not later than the end of the third business day following the day the request was received by the board. 3 responses are acceptable. 1, the record is provided in the form requested if possible. 2, the request is under review and the record is if permitted will follow. And 3, the request is denied with a detailed explanation for the denial. So this does not mean that we have to provide all records within 3 days. Based on the detail of the request, it could take us some time to review our records. And also, if we have a number of other items we're currently working on, we have to make sure that we respond within those 3 days to let them know that we received it and then what our next step is. But we do have some time to research those records. And so our 3-day requirement has to do with our response to those open records requests. Under the KORA, there is a presumption of openness. As such, the requested public records must be released unless the exemption to disclosure applies. The burden rests on the board to prove the requested records are exempt from disclosure. Exemptions to disclosure may be discretionary or mandatory. The KORA is a civil act, not a criminal act. And then similar to what we talked about for coma violations, you have information here about individuals if they choose to bring a complaint about a KORA request. And then such actions are assigned to a trial date at the earliest practicable date. The district court may review the requested records in camera. If they are brought, some of the possible fines for a violation of quora could include 500 per violation, and that could be imposed for a knowing violation or an intentional failure to furnish information. Cost and reasonable attorney's fees, including appeals, may be imposed if the board's denial is not made in good faith and without a reasonable basis in fact or law. That is the core request. One thing to know in terms of your role as an advisory committee member or as a board member is that there are a lot of items that would be considered a record. And this does not have to do with all paper documents or all items that are very clearly, a record. This has to do with any communication that would fall under what has been described before. So something like a text message could be considered a record. Something like a voicemail could potentially be considered a record in certain circumstances. And so you just need to be mindful of when you're creating a record and what needs to be retained. One thing that we recommend is that if you do have communication that involves advisory committee activity and you want to make sure that it's something that we can assist you with, you can always copy me on those communications. And then that way, if you receive a request, we can search for what information we have available, and then we can produce that information. But just be mindful, I know you all are professionals, you're used to hearing similar information in other trainings, I'm sure, but it's always good to be reminded that even the casual conversations and communications, those can still be considered a record. I recently saw an article in the Capitol Journal where there was some Teams communications back and forth that were they were provided an open records request. And so it's always good to be reminded of what can constitute an open record and what could be out there if someone makes such a request. So if you have questions on that, please let me know, and I'm happy to talk to you about it further. Just a little bit of time, I'm going to talk about the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or the CAPA. The Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, it creates procedural rights and imposes only procedural duties. The CAPA does not provide substantive law. Those laws are governed by the Board's Enabling Act and Licensing Act. The CAPA applies only to the extent that other statutes expressly provide the provisions of the CAPA govern those provisions. We'll get into a little more detail about what that means. The general rule is that licensing boards like the BSRB must do business in an open meeting under the COMA unless directed by statute to conduct proceedings or hearings pursuant to the CAPA. Those two acts are mutually exclusive. So in certain circumstances, we will do business under the COMA, such as board meetings, advisory committee meetings, and then in other instances, we will do business under the CAPA if we have a specific authority to do that. When a licensing board statute provides the CAPA applies to certain decisions, the board shall follow the CAPA, not the COMA. When making those decisions, the CAPA sets out a procedure to follow when the board is deciding what to do in cases involving individual licensees, such like the procedure that is followed in court cases. So when we're talking about broad license groups, then those would be something we would discuss in an open meeting, at a board meeting, or an advisory committee meeting, such as changes to statutes or changes to regulations. If we're talking about one specific person due to confidentiality and other reasons, we're allowed to discuss those under the CAPA in a closed session, and that allows the board to review that information and make a determination. Now, if the board does determine that the license should be denied, there are some protections, and the individual does have the right to request a hearing, and that hearing would be open to the public, but we'll get into that a little bit more. So in certain types of cases, the board is conducting a quasi-judicial function in deciding the outcome of a case. When the CAPA applies, none of the stages of a particular case has to be open to the public observation other than the hearing, which I just mentioned. Each of the board's licensing act have a CAPA provision. Under the CAPA, neither the public nor the applicant has to be notified when the board is to meet to consider an application for licensure. Similarly, under the CAPA, neither the public nor the licensee has to be notified when the Complaint Review Committee, or the CRC, meets to consider whether probable cause exists on a disciplinary case or issue a summary proceeding order. Additionally, the board and the CRC do not need to take a vote in public for decisions made under the CAPA. Under the CAPA, decisions are made when the license or an order is issued. The necessary board staff and the board or CRC's attorney can be present during the CAPA discussions to make sure the board members have the information or legal advice they need to make an informed decision. There are some board activities that are not covered by the CAPA, and these must be acted on in an open meeting under the COMA. These include approving board minutes, discussions and votes to approve or amend regulations or guidance documents, delegating authority to a board member or to the executive director for a particular action. Also receiving agency updates regarding the budget, legislation, statistics on complaints, and CRC activity, education, and the executive director's report. Decisions whether to renew contracts or change the way contracted services are provided, and policy decisions affecting the way the board operates internally. In terms of applications for licensure, a person who files an application for licensure has the burden of proof, and then staff will gather the information submitted by the applicant for the board's consideration in determining whether an applicant is qualified for license or whether a license may be conditioned or restricted. If the board denies conditions or restricts a license, the applicant may request a hearing if the applicant did not agree to such action in a consent agreement and order. The kind of a term for the agreement that's put out when an individual goes through a disciplinary proceeding and a public finding of discipline is created. In terms of investigations, the board has the burden of proof to show a licensee has violated a statute or regulation. All licensing boards can investigate complaints or allegations that a licensee has violated its statutes and regulations. The board's investigator generally gathers information and then presents that information to the Complaint Review Committee or the CRC. The CRC reviews the information and determines whether there is probable cause or reasonable ground to believe that a violation of the specific statutes or regulations has occurred. Reasonable grounds means information that would lead to a reasonable, prudent person to believe that the licensee violated one of the board's statutes or regulations. When making the determination, the CRC must make sure the conduct that the licensee is accused of actually violates one of the board's statutes or regulations. The fact that the licensee did something that made someone angry, violated a professional association's ethical code, or did not follow an employer's policy does not necessarily mean the licensee violated a statute or regulation. The licensee can request a hearing on the summary proceeding order within a certain prescribed time period. Once a petition or a request for hearing is filed, the CAPA guides the proceeding and the hearing. If there's immediate danger to public health, safety, or welfare, the CRC may suspend the license without giving the licensee notice and an opportunity for a hearing. That is pretty rare, but the licensee may appeal an emergency order in the district court. And then the last item I'll talk about here broadly has to do with the Kansas Tort Claims Act. So the Kansas Tort Claims Act generally covers the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees. An employee includes a member of a board or committee of a governmental entity, including elected or appointed officials and persons acting on behalf of or in service of a governmental entity in an official capacity, whether or not without compensation. The basic rule of the Kansas Tort Claims Act is that vicarious liability for any actionable wrongful act or omission of a government employee within the course and scope of their employment, subject to affirmative grants of immunity that may exist on a case-by-case basis. If you are sued for an act that occurred within your scope of duties as a board member or as an advisory committee member, you are entitled to have the state defend you at no cost. So while we hope that never occurs, and I'm not familiar with it happening, at least since the time that I've been with the agency, I want to make you aware of this just in case something does occur and you get a notification that you are sued based on something that you have done as a member of the advisory committee or as a board member. If that does happen to you, please feel free to reach out to me and we will contact the Attorney General's office and put these things into place. Because there is a process we have to follow to request representation. If that occurs, then hopefully it never does, but you need to be mindful of this just in case it does happen. The general rule is the state will pay for any judgment rendered against you unless the judgment is for an act or omission that occurred outside the scope of your duties as a board member or advisory committee member, you failed to cooperate in your defense, or you acted with actual fraud or malice. And there is an Attorney General opinion that's posted on the BSRB website concerning whether or not advisory committee members are covered by the Kansas Tort Claims Act. And it was the opinion of the Attorney General that yes, advisory committee members were covered under this. So as I mentioned several times, hope this never comes up, but if it does, please get in touch with me and I can help. We can coordinate that through the legal counsel of the board as well to make sure that we're following up on all of this. So I realize that is quite a lot of material. This training is lengthy, but it's really important. And so at this point, I will end the training and see if there's any questions right now. You are also welcome to reach out to me by email, or we can set up a time to have a conversation afterwards, but thought I would pause here and see if you have any questions immediately following the training.
Seeing and hearing none. David, in the interest of time, we've got 15 minutes left, roughly. I know that under 8B, that is a lengthy discussion. I know that 9, as we had discussed in our meeting together, that could potentially be a bit of a lengthy discussion. We could discuss 8A in brief, and we could discuss item 10. Would you like to proceed in that direction?
I think that sounds good. And you know, as far as 8B and 9, I could kind of frame that for the members of the committee, knowing that there are new members of the committee. That could be something that I can just kind of, you know, set the stage for, and then that way members can research those items in preparation for the next meeting. If that sounds
Yes,
okay.
that sounds good. So we'll move to old business under 8A.
So I mentioned earlier that Kansas is part of a multi-state compact for licensed psychologists that is called SIPAC. And Kansas joined that compact just about a year and a half ago. That allows licensed psychologists in Kansas to apply to the SIPAC Commission to either practice a limited number of days physically in state and other compact states, or they can apply for the ability to provide telehealth services in all compact states. Currently, the number of individuals that are licensed in Kansas providing those services in other compact states, there are 85 individuals. As of the most recent report in July, 85 individuals with a licensed psychology degree who are providing services under the telehealth, and then 8 who are providing a limited number of days of in-state service. And so I did include in your materials the commission news from July. There's some good information in there about the growth of the compact. There are additional states that continue to join, but there are quite a few states that are already a member. I believe probably close to about 35, if not more, have joined the compact. In terms of just some updates for SIPAC, I recently attended the SIPAC mid-year meeting that was July 13th, 2023. Of note, there are 2 proposed rule changes that are out for public comment right now. One of those proposed rule changes, actually they're similar. The authorization to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology is called an APIT, and the ability to provide those limited in-state days of service is called a TAP, temporary authorization to practice. The 2 rules that are out for comment, so basically, if you apply to the SIPAC Commission and you get authority to practice, that allows you to do those services. But there are some jurisdictions that essentially say if you have the ability to practice, others may have an implied ability of certain rights based on maybe somebody practicing under your license. And so having the ability to practice under SIPAC, there was a question of, would that relate to any abilities of supervisors, supervisees, or other individuals based on you holding SIPAC ability to practice in those states? And so what SIPAC put out for public comment was 2 proposed rule changes to further clarify that your ability to practice under SIPAC authority is really just limited to your ability to practice. And so Rule 4.13 states that for those APITs that are issued by the SIPAC Commission, they only apply to specific authorization holders. Authorization does not extend to supervisors, supervisees, or any other individual. And then further under 5.13, that would be for the individuals with a temporary authorization to practice, or the TAP. And that is those items that are issued by SIPAC Commission only apply to the specific authorization holder. Authorization does not extend to supervisors, supervisees, or other individuals. So they just wanted to clarify this, if there was any confusion about how the authority to practice under SIPAC might relate to those different groups. So that is posted on the front page of the BSRB website. If you want to take a closer look at that, there is also a link to provide public comment directly back to SIPAC, and that is open for public comment until October 3rd, 2023. After that closes, there will be an annual meeting for SIPAC later this year, and that will just be remote. So I'll be attending that on behalf of the state of Kansas, and I'll bring back any updates from that annual meeting after that time. And I think that's all the information I have to share on SIPAC at this time.
I have a quick question regarding that. So the vote on that would be limited to the commissioners for each state that's a part of the SIPAC, correct? It's not going to be the individuals who hold licenses that are a part of SIPAC, correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
under the commission, every state was asked to identify one person to serve as the commissioner for that state. Most of the commissioners are executive directors for the different boards. Some of them are board members, but that is the vast majority of the different members. So when we joined SIPAC, the board appointed me to be the commissioner for Kansas. And so when that vote is taken, I'll be asked to vote on behalf of the state of Kansas. And so our next meeting, if you have thoughts on that matter, if you want me to bring forward anything, I would be bringing forward on behalf of the board, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great.
And like I said, that's all that I have for SIPAC, but there is that information posted on our website, so you can read that, and then other individuals who may not be watching this meeting, they have access to it as well.
So moving on to 8B, to frame the discussion that we would have in our next meeting in October, David, I'll have you kick off that discussion about our discussion on unprofessional conduct regulations.
Okay. So in your packet of material, you have a 42-page document that is the unprofessional conduct regulations for all 7 of the professions. Last year, the board began a comprehensive process to review the unprofessional conduct regulations for each of the professions. Those were sent to the advisory committees, and every advisory committee spent time reviewing the language in their unprofessional conduct regulations, attempting to see, are there any items that are missing? Are there any items that are outdated that are appropriate to be removed? Is there language that is vague or confusing that we can make more clear, or other possible changes? And so each of the advisory committees recommended changes and submitted those back to the board for review. The board thought it would be helpful to go ahead and return the combined list back to the advisory committees, so that way what we're asking you to do at this stage is to review all of the proposed changes for each of the advisory committees to see if perhaps something that the professional counseling advisory committee discussed and is proposing for a change might also be a good change for the licensed psychology profession, or something potentially that the addiction counselors had discussed maybe was not a topic that your profession had discussed. And so between now and the next meeting, we would ask that you review all of those and then, be ready to discuss any proposed changes to your own regulations. And then the goal is for those to be forwarded back to the board probably after the next meeting. So that way the board could recommend changes to these regulations by the end of this calendar year to begin to get those submitted through the regulation review process. The legislature did basically make a charge to state agencies a couple of years ago to really be mindful of the regulations and make sure that we are timely in updating any language or making it more friendly for the members of the public. And for a number of the different professions, this was a set of regulations that had not been updated or adjusted in several years. And so it was definitely time to look at these. And there has been a great amount of good, healthy conversation by the different advisory committees. So please continue to review these and then come to the next meeting being ready to discuss if there are further changes that you would recommend be forwarded to the board for their consideration.
And if I might add, the Psychology Advisory Committee, we went point by point over the course of 2022 and into 2023 in terms of our conduct regulations. And there are points of differences that stand out between our advisory committee and the other advisory committees that I would certainly ask you all to be on the lookout for, and we can have a fruitful and mindful discussion about what those differences are in our next meeting. So, David, I'll have you move on to new business and framing the discussion around number 9, and that's the ASPPB matter regarding the certificate of professional qualifications.
Okay, so this new item is something that I was contacted by members of ASPPB recently, and they were asking essentially if Kansas would be in favor of potentially pursuing the CPQ. And I admit I was not familiar with the CPQ, and I have started the process to research this, but ASPPB is an association for the different regulatory boards for the psychology profession. And one of the items that it oversees is this CPQ program. And essentially the CPQ, the purpose of it is to document that individuals holding the certificate have met specific requirements in licensure, education, examination, and training, and have never had any disciplinary action taken against his or her license. And then there's a number of psychology boards that accept the CPQ, either when someone is trying to become licensed or in lieu of other requirements when they're trying to become licensed. And for those that have accept it, have agreed to accept the holder's educational preparation, supervised experience, and education performance for licensure. The CPQ does not constitute a license to practice, but it can be helpful in terms of mobility and different things like that. So I have given you in your packet a sort of a one-page summary of the CPQ. I would ask if you do have time to go ahead and review that information, become a little more knowledgeable about CPQ as I do the same. The second document is a list of the jurisdictional participation in the CPQ, or the Certificate of Professional Qualifications in Psychology. Currently, there are 43 jurisdictions that accept the CPQ. Now, for psychology, the association includes not only the states, but also the Canadian provinces and DC. So I believe there's about 30 to 32 states that currently recognize it. There are also some jurisdictions that may waive at least one of the license requirements for people who hold the CPQ. And then there are 2 jurisdictions that are currently in the process of reviewing it to potentially accept the CPQ. So a majority of states have acted on this. I'm not familiar with the history of Kansas as it relates to this, but I definitely think it's something I wanted to bring to your attention as members of this community. I would really appreciate hearing your thoughts on if you think it's something that we could consider. We are mindful of protecting the public, but if there's ways we can become even more efficient and effective in licensing individuals, it's always helpful to be able to have those conversations. So potentially, this could be something that we could consider adopting at some point, or, you know, in your role as an advisory committee member, what our role would be to review this. And if you think it's something that could be helpful to add to the statutes or regulations, we could forward a recommendation back to the board. And then if the board votes to take official action, at that point, we could get that moving through the process. But as I mentioned, when it was brought to my attention, I was not very familiar with it. And so I've been doing research, but I would appreciate if you could do the same and then bring back thoughts for discussion at the next board meeting or the advisory committee meeting.
And I'll be honest, I had not heard about this either. It kind of sounds like what is done with when people go to get when they go for their ABAP, but it's sort of different than that process even. But I would encourage us to read the information that David sent out to us and come back in October, which leads us to the final item on the agenda, which is the meetings that are proposed to be held for the rest of 2023. We had considered that this time, Tuesdays, the second Tuesdays of the month from 6 to 8 p.m. would still be times that would work for people. It still works for me. And David, I'll turn it over to you to kind of finish out the discussion on this.
Yeah, I think that's been a consistent time for the advisory committee, at least for the last few years. Just kind of want to open up and to make sure that was still something that would be good with having so many new members. But our meetings primarily would continue to be remote, knowing that you are from all over the state. But potentially, if you wanted to have an in-person meeting, we could assist with that. But most of these would probably be remote meetings that you would log into at 6 and be done by 8. And so just kind of wanted to continue that, but get some input from you.
I feel real good about it. I'm Mark Goodman in Hutchinson, and I like the time and the timing, and the day of the week works well for me.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
I'm good with it.
Still works for me.
Well, I'm seeing some head nodding and I've
Yeah.
heard from some folks indicating that this would still be a good time and day. So let's say that we will keep the last two meetings on the calendar for Tuesday, the 10th of October and Tuesday, the 12th of December, and we will return to this matter for 2024 meetings. In our December meeting, David, is that when we will discuss 2024?
Yes, we could talk about it at the next meeting if you want to go ahead and put dates on the calendar. So maybe be looking forward into next year if you'd like to have that conversation next meeting.
We can absolutely do that. With that being said, it is 7:59. So we are a minute early and I will take a motion to adjourn our meeting.
I move we adjourn.
Doug moves. Do I have a second?
Yes, I agree.
Mark seconds. All those in favor of adjournment, please signify aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. The motion passes. It's good to see all of you, and I look forward to seeing you all in 2 months. You all have a good rest of your Tuesday evening.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.